Let's see what's under the little hero act. The fabric tore like a gunshot. 200 phones went up at once. Harper Doyle stood in the middle of that hallway, her father's jacket hanging off one shoulder in ruins, the last gift he ever gave her. Wyatt Kessler held a fistful of gray cotton like a trophy, waiting for her to cry. She didn't cry. Her feet shifted. Her breathing slowed. Her hands came up, and every person close enough could see the calluses across her knuckles. My father was a United States Marine, she said. He died saving 4 soldiers, and he taught me that violence is always the last resort. Wyatt laughed. It came out thin. So what, you gonna karate chop me? No, Harper said. I'm giving you one chance to walk away. He didn't take it. 3 seconds later, the star quarterback was on the floor, and nobody at Ridgemont University would ever forget her name again. The hallway outside Kessler Hall went quiet all at once. That kind of quiet has a sound to it. You can hear it if you've ever stood in the middle of one. Phones came up. Feet stopped moving. Somebody near the vending machine whispered, "Oh my God," and then nobody said anything else. Harper Doyle stood with her jacket torn clean off one shoulder, the fabric hanging by a few threads at her elbow. Wyatt Kessler stood 3 feet away, breathing hard, a fistful of gray cotton still in his hand, like he'd caught something, like he'd won something. She didn't cover herself. She didn't step back. She planted her feet the way her father taught her back when she was 9 years old and too small for the moves he was showing her in the garage. Weight low, chin down, hands loose until they weren't. Wyatt laughed, but it came out thin. "What are you gonna do?" he said. "Cry." Harper didn't cry. She let her breathing slow down the way she'd practiced 100 times, 1,000 times, in a garage back in Ohio, with a heavy bag swinging and her father's voice in her ear. "Center yourself. Find your balance. Never fight angry." And then everything that happened next happened so fast that half the phones recording it couldn't even keep the frame steady. But that's the end of the story, not the beginning. To understand how a college football star ended up on the floor of a dormitory hallway with a girl standing over him, you have to go back 3 weeks. You have to go back to a cardboard box that never got unpacked, and a black belt folded inside a suitcase, and a promise made to a photograph. Harper Doyle's father had been a Marine for 14 years. Sergeant First Class Michael Doyle. 2 tours overseas. A man who could field strip a rifle blindfolded and still tuck his daughter in. Every night he was home reading the same 3 chapters of the same beat-up paperback until she finally fell asleep. He came home from his last deployment in one piece. That was the part nobody warned them about. He survived the wars. He didn't survive a training accident on a base in North Carolina 8 months before Harper packed her bags for college. A live fire exercise gone wrong. A young private who froze at the wrong second. Michael Doyle threw himself in the way without thinking twice, because that was who he was, right up until the last second of his life. Harper was 17 when they told her. She remembered the 2 officers at the door in their dress uniforms, and she remembered her mother's knees giving out before either of them said a word. She remembered thinking even then, in the middle of the worst moment of her life, that her father would have hated seeing her mother on the floor like that. He would have wanted somebody standing. So Harper stood. She stood through the funeral, through the flag folded into a tight triangle, and placed in her hands, through the sound of the 21 gun salute that made her flinch, even though she'd been warned it was coming. She stood through 8 months of watching her mother move through the house like a ghost, looking for the person who used to live there. And in August, she stood at the edge of a dorm room in Texas, 3 states, and a whole life away from Ohio, holding a suitcase with her father's black belt folded on top of her clothes. "This is a good school," her mother said for maybe the 5th time that week. Diane Doyle had a way of repeating things when she needed to believe them. "Ridgemont has a great psych program. You're going to do so well here." "I know, Mom. And it's not too far. 6 hours isn't too far." "I know." Diane looked at her daughter for a long moment, the kind of look mothers give when they're trying to memorize a face before it walks away from them. "Your father would be so proud of you," she said. "Starting over, being brave." Harper didn't feel brave. She felt like a girl standing in a room full of boxes. She didn't have the energy to open 3 states from the only house she'd ever lived in, listening to some guy down the hall blast music through the wall like the world hadn't ended 8 months ago for somebody. But she smiled for her mother, because that was easier than the truth, and she'd gotten good at that particular kind of easy lately. Ridgemont University sat on 400 acres of Texas hill country, all limestone buildings and manicured lawns, the kind of campus that showed up in brochures because it photographed like money. And it was money. Harper had learned that fast in the first 20 minutes of walking from the parking lot to her dorm. The cars alone told the story. Rows of them gleaming in the August heat, more BMWs than she'd ever seen outside a car lot, a few trucks lifted so high you'd need a stepladder to reach the door handle. She'd gotten in on a scholarship. Full-ride academic and a smaller fund set aside for children of fallen service members, something the school's financial aid office had found for her without her even asking. It felt like the first piece of good luck her family had gotten in almost a year. And some days, it still felt like charity dressed up as opportunity. She tried not to think about that too hard. Her dorm room in Ashwood Hall was small cinder block walls, painted the color of weak coffee, one window that looked out over a parking lot instead of the quad. Her roommate hadn't arrived yet. Good. Harper needed a little more time before she had to perform being fine for a stranger, too. She unpacked slowly. Clothes in the dresser, books on the shelf. And last, carefully, she lifted the black belt out of the suitcase and held it for a second longer than she needed to. Her father had earned it over 11 years, one careful promotion at a time, training in whatever gym happened to be near whatever base they were stationed at that year. He used to say the belt didn't mean anything by itself. It was just a strip of fabric. What mattered was everything underneath it. The discipline, the years, the nights you didn't want to show up, but you did anyway. "I won't let you down, Dad," she said quietly to the empty room. And then she felt a little ridiculous for saying it out loud and hung the belt over the closet door where she could see it from her bed. That night, she called Madison Sinclair, her best friend since middle school, still back home finishing her own last year before college. "Okay, tell me everything," Madison said. "Is it as fancy as it looks on Instagram?" "Fancier," Harper said. "There's a guy 2 doors down who has an actual espresso machine in his dorm room. Like a real one, with the steam wand." "That's disgusting. I love it. Tell me more." Harper laughed, and it felt good, the first real laugh in what felt like weeks. They talked for almost an hour about nothing important about Madison's summer job and a boy she liked, and whether Harper's roommate situation would work out. And for that hour, Harper almost forgot to be sad. Almost forgot she was starting over completely alone, in a place where nobody knew her name yet, let alone her father's. Before they hung up, Madison got quiet for a second. "You doing okay?" she asked. "Really okay. Not just okay. "I'm managing," Harper said, which was as close to honest as she could get most days. "Just don't disappear on me," Madison said. "You do that. You go quiet when things get hard. Promise you'll call. I promise." She meant it when she said it. She wouldn't be very good at keeping that promise, not because she wanted to break it, but because disappearing was the only trick she had left that still worked. Orientation week passed in a blur of name tags and campus tours and 100 well-meaning strangers asking where she was from and what she wanted to study. Questions she answered on autopilot, while some other part of her brain sat off to the side, watching, waiting to see if this new place was going to be safe or not. On the second afternoon, wandering the edge of campus alone, rather than joining the group icebreaker games the orientation leaders kept organizing, Harper found a small stone memorial tucked behind the chapel, easy to miss unless you were already looking for it. A modest granite marker listing the names of Ridgemont alumni who had died in service going back through several wars, flanked by a single flagpole and a low iron bench worn smooth by years of quiet visitors. She sat there a long while, reading the names one by one, feeling something in her chest loosen just slightly, for the first time since arriving in Texas. It wasn't her father's name carved into that stone. It never would be, since he'd never attended Ridgemont himself. But something about the place still felt like a small, unexpected kindness. A corner of this enormous, unfamiliar campus that understood in its own quiet way what it cost a family to lose someone like that. She came back to that bench more than once over the following weeks, usually in the early evening. Usually when the weight of everything happening around her got too heavy to carry through a crowded dining hall or a lecture full of strangers. She never told anyone about it, not even Madison. Some places she was learning worked better as private ones. She noticed Wyatt Kessler on the second day, though she didn't know his name yet. He was hard not to notice. 6'3", built the way guys get built when a personal trainer has been part of their life since middle school, holding court on the tailgate of a truck that cost more than most people's houses. There was a group around him, the way there's always a group around guys like that, laughing at things that weren't especially funny, watching him for cues on what to feel next. He clocked Harper walking by and said something to the two guys next to him. She didn't hear what. She didn't need to. She'd seen that particular look before more than once in more than one town. It was the look of someone deciding you were interesting, because you hadn't looked back yet. She kept walking. Classes started the following Monday. Harper had picked a seat in the middle of her Intro to Psychology lecture, not so close to the front that she'd stand out, not so far back that she'd look like she didn't care. She'd gotten good at finding that exact middle spot in every classroom in every school for the last 2 years. It was a small, specific skill, and she hated that she'd needed to develop it. The cafeteria was worse than any classroom, the way cafeterias always are. Ridgemont's dining hall was enormous, all high ceilings and long tables. And within about 4 days, Harper had mapped out its invisible geography, the same way she'd have mapped a minefield. The football players in their circle owned the tables by the windows. The Greek life crowd took the middle section. Everybody else filled in around the edges, sorted by major or hometown or whatever quiet gravity pulls strangers into groups. Harper found a table in the corner alone and told herself that was fine. She was 3 bites into a sandwich when the shadow fell across her tray. "Hey, you're the new girl from Ohio, right?" She looked up. It was him. Up close, he was even bigger than he'd looked from across the quad, and he had the kind of easy practice smile that told her he was used to it landing exactly the way he wanted it to. "Wyatt Kessler," he said like the name should mean something. Around Ridgemont, it apparently did. "You're in my econ lecture. Back row, I noticed you." "That's nice," Harper said, and meant it to sound polite and final at the same time. "I've got a class in a few minutes, though. I should go. Class doesn't start for 20 minutes. He didn't sit exactly, but he leaned one hand on the table close enough that it felt less like conversation and more like a decision he'd already made for her. "Relax. Let me buy you a coffee sometime. Everybody who's anybody here knows me. I could make your freshman year a lot easier." Something about the phrase made her father's voice show up in her head, unbidden. He used to say that the men most in love with their own charm were usually the ones who'd never had to hear the word no and mean anything by it. "I appreciate it," she said, standing, gathering her tray. "But I really do need to go." His hand didn't grab her. Not yet. It just came up casual, resting against the table's edge in a way that blocked her path without technically touching her at all. A small thing. The kind of small thing that's easy to explain away later if anyone ever asks about it. "Come on," he said, and his smile had a slight edge to it now, the first crack in the charm. "I'm being nice here." "I need to get to class," Harper said again, and stepped around his arm and walked away without looking back. The cafeteria had gone quiet in that particular way. Cafeterias do the low murmur under the surface of every conversation shifting into something sharper. Behind her, she heard one of Wyatt's friends laugh, not quite quiet enough. "Dude, did she seriously just walk off on you?" She didn't hear what Wyatt said back. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of it in the air the whole way to her next class, that specific electric hum of a room, deciding something interesting had just happened, and that she was now, whether she liked it or not, a character in somebody else's story. That night, she called Madison again and told her about it, laughing it off the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself something wasn't a big deal. "Careful with that one," Madison said once Harper finished. There was no laughter in her voice at all. "Guys like that. Guys who've never heard no, They don't usually take it well the first time somebody actually says it. "I can handle myself," Harper said, glancing over at the black belt hanging on her closet door. "That's not what I'm worried about," Madison said. "I'm worried about the part where handling yourself becomes necessary in the first place. Just be careful. Please." "I will." She meant that too. She wouldn't be very good at keeping that promise either, though not because she went looking for trouble. Trouble, as it turned out, wasn't in a rush to wait for her. The first sign came 4 days later. Harper's phone buzzed during her Tuesday afternoon lab, 3 texts in a row from a number she didn't recognize, and then a 4th from a girl in her dorm she barely knew, sending a screenshot with the message, "You should see this." It was an Instagram account. Her name misspelled slightly. Her photo one she recognized from the university's own new student welcome page, cropped and filtered until it looked almost nothing like her. The bio underneath read in a cruel little parody of a personal statement, something about being too good for Ridgemont boys, and a string of comments already piling up underneath, some from real students, some clearly fake accounts thrown together in the last hour. She sat in the back of the lab with her stomach dropping, scrolling through comment after comment, feeling the room tilt slightly around her, even though nothing in the room had actually moved. Her first thought was Wyatt. It had to be Wyatt. Who else would even bother? She was wrong about that, though she wouldn't find out how wrong for almost 3 more weeks. The account had actually been built by a girl named Paige Whitmore, a sophomore who dated Wyatt on and off since high school and had spent the better part of the last year trying to claw her way back into being his on-again girlfriend instead of his off-again one. Paige had heard about the cafeteria rejection within about an hour of it happening, the way anything involving Wyatt Kessler traveled through Ridgemont at roughly the speed of sound, and she'd seen an opportunity in it. If she could make the new girl look ridiculous, cruel, stuck-up, maybe Wyatt would remember exactly why he used to like Paige so much. Maybe humiliating Harper would be the thing that won her back a seat at his table. It was a small, sad, human kind of cruelty, not orchestrated by some football star flexing his power. Just a girl who'd convinced herself that someone else's pain might finally be the thing that made her feel chosen. Harper had no way of knowing any of that yet. All she had was a fake account with her face on it, spreading through a campus of 8,000 strangers, and a growing, sinking certainty that she'd made an enemy on her 4th day of college without meaning to make one at all. She reported the account before her lab even ended. It didn't come down for 6 days. The whispers started almost immediately after that. Not loud enough to call out directly, just the particular hush of conversation stopping when she walked into a room, a couple of girls in her hallway, who used to nod hello, now looking somewhere just past her shoulder instead. Harper did what she'd always done in every school and every hard season of her life. She kept her head down. She went to class. She took notes. She smiled when smiling was called for, and said nothing when nothing was the safer option. And every night after her homework was done, and her roommate had gone to sleep or gone out, she pulled on a t-shirt and running shorts and went down to the small fitness room in the basement of Ashwood Hall to hit the heavy bag they kept in the corner, mostly ignored, mostly unused, until Harper started showing up. She trained the way her father had taught her. Not angry, never angry. Just steady, controlled, each strike landing exactly where she meant it to land, her breathing, even the entire time. "Karate is not about violence, Harper," he used to tell her. His voice came back to her, clear as anything, even 8 months gone, even 1,000 miles from the garage where he'd first said it. "It's about discipline, about protection. You never throw the first punch. Then what if they keep pushing, Dad?" she'd asked him once, maybe 13 years old, frustrated after a hard day at school. Then you make sure he'd said they can't throw a second one. She hit the bag until her knuckles ached and her shirt stuck to her back. And some nights that was the only hour of the day she felt like herself, instead of a girl performing being fine. It was on one of those nights, walking back to her dorm a little after 11, that she first really talked to Walter Higgins. Walter worked security for the Ashwood Hall complex, a job he'd taken on 4 years earlier after retiring from the Army, 22 years of service behind him, most of it as a supply sergeant, the last few overseeing logistics for a unit that included, as it happened, more than a few young men who reminded him in one way or another of his own son. His son hadn't come home from his second deployment. Walter didn't talk about that with strangers. He barely talked about it with the people who already knew. He was 61 years old, built like a man who used to be much bigger and had shrunk down into something quieter and harder instead. And he noticed things other people missed, because noticing things had kept him and the people around him alive for a long time. He noticed Harper. Not the way Wyatt Kessler had noticed her, sizing her up like an opportunity. Walter noticed the way she walked careful and aware, checking exits, the way trained people do without even realizing they're doing it. He noticed the small unit patch pin she kept clipped inside her jacket, tucked where most people wouldn't see it. He recognized the patch. It took him half a second longer than it should have to place it. And when he did, something in his chest went tight and careful all at once. "Evening," he said the first time she passed his little security desk near the entrance later than most students came through. "Late night." "Just working out," Harper said. He nodded toward the pin on her jacket, not quite pointing at it. "3rd Battalion," he said. "You got somebody in that unit?" Harper's hand went instinctively to the pin, the way it always did when somebody noticed it. "My dad," she said. "He passed in a training accident 8 months ago." Something passed over Walter's face, quick gone almost before it landed. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and he meant it in a way that went deeper than the words usually did when people said them to her. "I served 22 years myself. Army, not Marines, but I know that patch." He paused. "Your father have a name? Michael Doyle." Walter went very still for a second. Harper noticed it the way she noticed everything lately, but she didn't ask about it. Some doors you don't push on until somebody opens them for you. "You take care getting back to your room," Walter said instead, his voice a little rougher than it had been a minute before. "Anything gives you trouble around here, you come find me first. Understand?" "I will," Harper said. "Thank you." She didn't know yet how much that offer would come to matter. She didn't know that Walter Higgins had in fact crossed paths with a young private named Ramirez 2 years before he retired, a private who'd once told him half drunk and shaken about a training accident, and a sergeant who'd thrown himself into the path of something so the private wouldn't have to. She didn't know Walter had spent 2 nights after that conversation unable to sleep, thinking about the family that man must have left behind. She didn't know that when he'd read her father's name back to her, some quiet circle in his own life had just closed itself 8 months late and 1,000 miles from where it started. She just knew he seemed kind and steady, and that was enough for now. The Instagram account came down eventually, but the damage had already spread the way that kind of thing always does, quietly through group chats and hallway glances, until Harper could feel it every time she walked into a lecture hall. Wyatt himself seemed to have mostly lost interest, which should have been a relief, and mostly was except for the fact that his friends hadn't lost interest at all. 2 of them, in particular. Tyler Reeves, who played linebacker and had approximately the emotional range of the equipment he used to hit people with on the field, and Brandon Cole, quieter, sharper, smart enough to know better, and weak enough to go along with things. Anyway, the kind of guy who laughed at every joke a second before he understood why it was funny. They started small. A shove in a crowded hallway that could be explained away as an accident. Comments muttered just loud enough to be heard about how Harper thought she was too good for everybody. A study group she'd been part of for 2 weeks suddenly finding excuses not to include her. Harper wrote it all down. Every incident dated, timed as specific as she could make it. It was a habit her father had drilled into her, early back when she was a kid getting bullied in 4th grade over something as small as a haircut. "Information is ammunition," he used to say. "Never fire until you have a clear shot." She kept a small notebook in the bottom of her backpack, now the same way she'd have kept a first aid kit, hoping she'd never need to use it for anything serious, keeping it close just in case. 3 weeks into the semester, on a Thursday evening, Harper walked out to the student parking lot behind Ashwood Hall to grab a textbook from her car and found all 4 tires slashed clean through. She stood there for a long moment in the fading light, just looking at it, feeling something cold settle low in her stomach. Not fear exactly, something closer to recognition. Like a piece had finally fallen into place that she'd been half expecting since the cafeteria, since the fake account, since every small shove and muttered comment in 3 weeks of careful escalating cruelty. She called campus security instead of the local police, mostly because it felt more manageable, and the person who showed up 15 minutes later, badge and flashlight and a clipboard, was Walter Higgins. He crouched down next to her front tire, running a gloved finger along the clean, deliberate slash marks, and his jaw tightened in a way Harper hadn't seen from him before. "This isn't random," he said quietly. "Somebody did this on purpose, and they knew what they were doing." "Can you check the cameras?" Harper asked. "There's one right over there on the light pole." Walter looked up at the camera, and something in his expression shifted just slightly into something more careful. "I'll check," he said. "Give me a minute." He came back 11 minutes later, and he didn't say much at first, just stood there with his flashlight off, looking at her in a way that made her stomach drop all over again. "Camera's footage from tonight is gone," he said finally. "System says it malfunctioned. 6 to 9 p.m. window. Nothing recorded." "That's the exact window," Harper said. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Walter said. "I don't think it is, either." He didn't tell her that night what he was already starting to suspect. That a malfunction lasting exactly the window somebody needed it to last wasn't a malfunction at all. That there were only a small handful of people on this campus with the kind of access or the kind of money to make a security system look somewhere else for 3 hours at exactly the right time. He didn't tell her because he didn't have proof yet, only a cold, careful suspicion sitting in his gut. The same kind of suspicion that had kept men alive under his watch for 22 years. What he did instead, quietly without telling anyone, was pull the backup files from the system's secondary drive before anybody could think to erase those two and copy them onto a small drive he kept locked in the bottom of his desk. He told himself he was just being careful. He told himself it was probably nothing. But some part of him, the part that had once failed to protect a young private sergeant, the part that had spent 2 sleepless nights thinking about a family he'd never met, wasn't willing to take that chance twice. He filed the vandalism report. He told Harper he'd keep an eye on things, and he said nothing yet about what he was starting to believe, because he needed more before he said it out loud, and because some warnings given too early only get you fired before you can do any good with them at all. Harper's mother called 2 nights later, the way she did most nights, checking in with the particular anxious cheerfulness of a parent trying very hard not to sound worried. "How's everything going, sweetheart? Classes, okay?" "Classes are fine, Mom. Making friends?" Harper hesitated half a second too long. "It's still early," she said. "Getting there." Diane Doyle heard the hesitation. Mothers usually do even 6 hours away, even through a phone line. "Harper, is something wrong?" "I'm fine, Mom. Really." She wasn't fine. She was lying the same easy lie she'd been telling for 8 months. The same lie that let her mother sleep a little easier at night, instead of lying awake worrying about a daughter who was in fact 3 weeks into being quietly, carefully harassed by a group of wealthy, popular strangers 1,000 miles from anyone who actually knew her. Some nights after she hung up, Harper sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the photograph she kept on her nightstand. Her father in his dress uniform, that particular half smile he always gave the camera, like he was in on some private joke nobody else could hear. "I'm handling it, Dad." She told the photograph quiet enough that her roommate wouldn't hear through the thin dorm walls. "I promise, I'm handling it." She believed that mostly. She believed it right up until the following Monday when she opened her dorm room door to leave for her 9 o'clock class and found someone had slid an envelope underneath it sometime overnight. Inside was a printout. A newspaper obituary, the same one that had run in her hometown paper 8 months earlier. Her father's photograph next to 2 paragraphs about his service and his sacrifice. Someone had circled the date of his death in red marker. Underneath, in the same red ink, 3 words had been written across the bottom of the page. "Miss him yet?" Harper stood in the hallway for a long time, holding that piece of paper, feeling something inside her go very cold and very still. The specific stillness that comes right before a person decides something important about who they're going to let themselves be. This wasn't rejection anymore. This wasn't a girl saying no to a boy who wasn't used to hearing it. This had crossed into something else entirely. Something deliberate and cruel and personal in a way that made her hands shake just slightly before she made them stop. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself a long time ago, standing at a funeral with a folded flag in her hands, that she wasn't going to let this year turn her into somebody who cried in hallways. But she stood very still for a full minute, breathing the way her father taught her, before she carefully folded the paper, slid it into her backpack next to her notebook of dates and incidents, and walked to class like nothing at all had happened. Wyatt Kessler, for his part, had no idea any of this was landing quite so hard. That was the strange thing about people like him. Cruelty for Wyatt rarely felt like cruelty. It felt like correcting an imbalance. A girl had embarrassed him in front of half the freshman class, and somewhere in his mind, Tyler and Brandon's escalating little campaign was just the natural cost of that embarrassment being paid back. He told himself he wasn't really involved. He hadn't slashed any tires. He hadn't written anything on any envelope. He was just a guy who'd been rejected in public, and other people had decided on their own to make that right for him. It was a comfortable story. Wyatt had been telling himself comfortable stories his whole life, mostly because comfortable stories were the only ones his father ever seemed interested in hearing. Marcus Kessler had built a real estate empire out of strip malls and subdivisions across 3 counties, and he'd built his son, as far as Wyatt could tell, the exact same way. Every problem got solved with money or pressure, usually both. Marcus had donated the new weight room at Ridgemont's athletic complex 2 years earlier, and there was a plaque with the family name on it bolted to the wall right by the entrance. The kind of thing Wyatt walked past every single day without ever really seeing it anymore. That Friday at practice, Coach Owens noticed something was off with his starting quarterback before the ball was even snapped. Owens had coached college football for almost 20 years, long enough to recognize the difference between a player who was locked in and a player who was somewhere else entirely, carrying something heavy he didn't want anybody to see. Wyatt threw 2 passes that sailed wildly off target in the first 10 minutes, hit a receiver so hard on a routine drill that the kid limped off, holding his ribs, and snapped at a freshman lineman for a mistake that wasn't even close to being his fault. "Kessler!" Owens finally barked, walking out onto the field and pulling his quarterback aside by the shoulder pad. "What in God's name is going on with you today?" "Nothing, Coach. I'm good." "You're not good. You're about to put somebody in the hospital." Owens studied him for a second, the way he studied most of his players, looking for whatever was actually underneath the surface answer. "This about that girl? The one from the cafeteria thing everybody's been talking about?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "It's not about anybody." Owens didn't push it further, not that day. But something about the exchange sat wrong with him for the rest of practice, an old uneasy feeling he recognized from somewhere further back than he wanted to think about right then. He'd had this exact conversation before, almost word for word, with almost the exact same tightness in a young man's jaw. He just hadn't let himself follow that thread all the way back yet. Not consciously, not out loud. He would eventually, but not yet. That evening, on her way to the fitness room, she passed Walter's desk, and he looked up at her with the particular sharpness of somebody who'd been trained a long time ago to read a person's face before they said a single word. "Something happened," he said. It wasn't really a question. Harper hesitated, then reached into her backpack and handed him the folded paper without a word. She watched him unfold it, watched his expression change as he read it. Watched something harden behind his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. "This is different from a slashed tire," Walter said quietly, when he finally looked back up at her. "This is somebody trying to break you on purpose. Somebody who knows exactly where it hurts." "I know," Harper said. Walter looked at the paper again, then back at her, and for a long moment he seemed to be weighing something, some decision he hadn't made yet. Then he folded the paper carefully back along its original creases and handed it to her. "Keep this," he said. "Keep everything, every single thing they do to you. You write it down, you keep a copy, and you bring it to me. You understand? Not the campus police first. Me first. I'll know what to do with it." "Why you?" Harper asked, not unkindly, just genuinely curious. Walter was quiet for a moment, looking at something past her shoulder. somewhere back in a memory she couldn't see. "Because I've made the mistake before of staying quiet when I shouldn't have," he said finally. "A long time ago. I'm not planning on making it twice." Harper didn't fully understand what he meant by that, not yet. She wouldn't understand it for another 2 weeks, not until a piece of the past finally connected itself to the present, in a conversation that would change the shape of everything. But something in the way he said it, steady and certain, and a little bit haunted, made her trust him completely, right there in that hallway, in a way she hadn't let herself trust anyone new in a very long time. "Okay," she said. "I will." That Thursday, she was walking back from the library later than she meant to, cutting through the mostly empty quad in the deep blue edge of evening, when a voice called out behind her, quiet, almost hesitant. "Hey, wait up a second." Harper turned, tensing automatically, and found a girl she didn't recognize jogging to catch up to her. Dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, a Ridgemont hoodie a size too big. The kind of tired, careful expression that Harper had started to recognize on her own face lately, without ever having seen it from the outside. "I'm Renee," the girl said, once she caught up a little out of breath. "Renee Ashford. I'm a sophomore. I don't think we've met, but I know who you are." "Okay," Harper said carefully. Renee glanced around the quad, an instinctive practice glance, checking who might be nearby to overhear. "I've been wanting to talk to you for a couple weeks now," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I just didn't know how, or if I should." "Talk to me about what—" Renee was quiet for a second, chewing on the inside of her cheek the way a person does when they're deciding whether to open a door they've kept closed a long time. "Wyatt Kessler," she said finally. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually believe me when I do." The evening air had gone still around them, the kind of stillness that settles right before something important gets said out loud for the first time in a long time. Harper felt her whole body go quiet and focused the same stillness she felt right before stepping onto a mat, right before a sparring match started, right before something that mattered was about to happen. "I'm listening," she said. Renee looked at her for a long moment, like she was deciding one final time whether this girl standing in front of her was actually strong enough to carry what she was about to hand her. Whatever she saw in Harper's face seemed to settle it. "Not here," Renee said quietly. "Somewhere we can actually talk. There's a lot you don't know yet. About him, about this school, about what happens to girls who say no to Wyatt Kessler and don't just disappear quietly afterward." She glanced once more across the darkening quad toward the lit windows of Kessler Hall in the distance, where laughter drifted faintly across the grass, easy and careless, the sound of people who had never once had to think about consequences. "You're not the first," Renee said. "And if we don't do something, you won't be the last either." Harper felt something settle into place inside her chest, quiet and certain, the same feeling she used to get standing across from her father on their old garage mats, both of them bowing before a match, both of them knowing exactly what was coming next. "Then tell me everything," she said. "Start from the beginning." Renee let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a very long time, longer than just that one conversation. "Not tonight," she said. "It's not a 5-minute story. Meet me Saturday. There's a coffee place off campus on 4th Street, away from all of this." She gestured vaguely at the buildings around them, at the whole glittering, expensive machine of Ridgemont University. "Somewhere nobody's going to walk by and recognize us together." "Okay," Harper said. "Saturday." Renee turned to go, then hesitated, looking back at her one more time. "For what it's worth," she said, "the way you handled yourself in that cafeteria, walking away instead of giving him a scene. I heard about it from 3 different people before I ever saw you in person. Word travels fast around here when somebody finally doesn't fold." "I didn't feel like I was handling anything," Harper admitted. "I felt like I was just trying to get through lunch." "That's usually how it feels," Renee said with a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Right up until it isn't anymore." She disappeared across the quad back toward the lit windows of the dorms, and Harper stood alone for a moment in the cooling evening air, turning the conversation over in her mind. 3 weeks ago, she hadn't known a single name at this school. Now she had a security guard quietly building a case file in a locked drawer and a sophomore she'd never met, promising her a story that apparently went back further than one bad semester. She thought about calling her mother that night and telling her everything. The fake account, the tires, the envelope, all of it laid out plainly instead of buried under. "I'm fine, Mom, really." She got as far as opening her phone and finding Diane's name in her contacts before she closed it again, unable to make herself do it. Not yet. Not until she had something solid enough to hand her mother besides fear. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and looked once more at her father's photograph on the nightstand, that same half-smile looking back at her like he already knew how this was going to go. "I think this is bigger than I thought, Dad," she said quietly. "I think I'm not the only one." Somewhere behind her back at her dorm, a black belt hung on a closet door waiting. Somewhere in a locked drawer in a security office, a hard drive sat quietly holding 3 hours of footage nobody was ever supposed to see again. And somewhere across campus, in a house that money had built and money still protected, a family was about to learn that some things cannot be bought back once they're broken. But that night, in the fading blue light of the quad, all Harper Doyle knew for certain was this. She had come to Ridgemont trying to disappear. Trying to be small and careful and quiet enough that grief could finally have somewhere safe to sit. Instead, without meaning to, she had become something else entirely. A girl 3 people had already started in 3 very different ways to believe in. She just didn't know yet how far that belief was about to travel or how much it was going to cost before it finally paid off. The coffee place on 4th Street was the kind of spot that didn't try very hard to be anything. Mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu with half the letters smudged. No Ridgemont students in sight, which was exactly why Renee had picked it. Harper got there first and took a table in the back corner, facing the door, an old habit she'd never bothered breaking. Renee showed up 10 minutes later in a plain hoodie with the hood half up, looking over her shoulder once before she sat down. "Sorry," Renee said. "I know that's paranoid." "It's not paranoid if it's true," Harper said. Renee almost smiled at that. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she needed something to hold on to before she started talking. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to tell you this straight through because if I stop in the middle, I don't think I'll finish it. So just let me get through it. Okay?" Harper nodded. "Freshman year," Renee said. "My freshman year, not yours. I was new here too. Didn't know anybody. Wyatt was a sophomore then, already the starting quarterback, already the guy everybody wanted something from." She turned her cup a quarter turn on the table, not drinking from it. "He was charming. That's the part people never understand until it happens to them. He wasn't scary at first. He was funny, and he paid attention to me in a way nobody else on this whole campus had bothered to yet. I thought I'd gotten lucky. What happened? There was a party. End of September, one of the off-campus houses the football guys rent every year. Renee's voice had gone flat and careful. The voice of someone reciting something they'd rehearsed 100 times in their head, so it would hurt less coming out loud. I had 1 drink, maybe 2. I don't actually know because at some point things started going strange, and I've never been sure if that was just me being a lightweight or something else. I woke up the next morning in a room I didn't recognize, and Wyatt was already gone, and I had bruises I couldn't explain, and I didn't remember enough of the night to explain them myself." Harper felt something cold settle in her chest, listening. "I didn't tell anybody for almost 3 weeks, Renee continued. "I kept thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd misjudged something, maybe it wasn't what it felt like. That's what happens. You talk yourself out of your own memory because the alternative is too big to hold." She finally looked up, meeting Harper's eyes directly. Looked up, meeting. "When I finally did tell somebody, I told the resident advisor in my dorm. She believed me. She helped me file a report with the university's Title IX office. And nothing," Renee said. That's the whole answer. Nothing happened. The investigation took 4 months and ended with a letter saying there wasn't sufficient evidence to support disciplinary action. 4 months, Harper. And 2 weeks after that letter went out, the athletic department announced a new locker room renovation. Guess whose name was on the plaque? Harper sat with that for a long moment, the noise of the coffee shop suddenly very far away. His father paid for it, she said quietly, to make it go away. Nobody ever said that directly, Renee said. Nobody ever has to say it directly. That's how it works. The money shows up right when it needs to, and everybody involved gets to pretend it's a coincidence. She wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. I'm not the only one either. There's a girl 2 years ahead of us, graduated last spring, same story, different year. And another one who transferred out after her sophomore year and never really explained why to anybody who asked. I only know about them because we found each other eventually, the way people who've been through the same thing always seem to find each other if they look hard enough. Why are you telling me this now? Harper asked. Why not before? Before the cafeteria, before any of it? Renee was quiet for a second. Because I didn't think it would matter, she said honestly. I've watched 2 other girls get run out of this school by that family, and I stopped believing anybody was ever going to actually stand up long enough to make a difference. And then I heard what you did. Just walking away from him in front of the whole cafeteria, not giving him the scene he wanted. She shook her head slightly. It's a small thing. I know it sounds small, but nobody does that. Not here. Everybody just goes along because going along is easier and because you learn fast that fighting the Kesslers costs you more than it costs them. So what do I do with this? Harper asked. You're telling me a story with no proof about a family that's already gotten away with it once. I know, Renee said. That's the hard part. I don't have proof either. Just what happened to me and what I've heard happened to 2 other girls and a locker room plaque with his father's name on it that shows up in the timeline a little too conveniently. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. This is the closest thing I have. It's a copy of the closure letter from the Title IX office. It doesn't prove anything on its own, but it's dated and it's real. And if you're building something, it's a place to start. Harper took the paper carefully and folded it into her jacket pocket next to the notebook she'd been keeping since the first week of school. Thank you for trusting me with this, she said. Don't thank me yet, Renee said. Thank me if it actually goes somewhere. Until then, all I've given you is a reason to be more scared than you already were. They talked for another hour, after that quieter, easier the way 2 people talk once the hardest part of a conversation is already behind them. Renee asked about Harper's father, and Harper found herself telling her more than she'd told almost anybody at Ridgemont so far, about the flag folded into a triangle, about the black belt, about a mother 6 hours away, trying so hard to sound cheerful on the phone every single night. Renee didn't try to fix any of it. She just listened, the particular kind of listening that comes from somebody who understands exactly how much weight a person can be carrying underneath an ordinary conversation. Harper walked back to campus alone as the sun went down, her mind turning over everything Renee had told her, the shape of it settling into something heavier and more complicated than she'd expected when she agreed to meet. She didn't call her mother that night either. She still didn't have enough to hand her yet. But for the first time since the fake account first appeared on her phone, she felt something other than fear underneath all of it. Something closer to purpose. Her mother called 2 nights later, same as always, same careful cheerfulness in her voice that Harper had learned to hear right through. How's everything, sweetheart? You sound tired. Harper almost lied the way she always did. She got as far as opening her mouth to say, I'm fine, Mom, really. And then for reasons she couldn't fully explain to herself, she didn't. Something's been happening here, she said instead. At school. It's not nothing, and I don't want to lie to you about it anymore. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the particular silence of a mother bracing herself. Okay, Diane said carefully. Tell me. Harper told her some of it, Not all of it yet, not the obituary, not the full weight of what Renee had shared, but enough. The rejection in the cafeteria, the fake account, the tires. Enough that her mother's breathing changed audibly on the other end of the phone. "Harper Ann Doyle," Diane said, using her full name the way she only did when she was frightened. "Why didn't you tell me any of this sooner?" "Because you already have enough to carry," Harper said honestly. "I didn't want to be one more thing you were scared about." "You are the thing I'm scared about," Diane said, her voice cracking slightly. "You're the only thing left I'm scared about, Harper. Please, let me carry some of this with you. That's what mothers are for, especially now." Harper felt something loosen in her chest, some tight, careful thing she'd been holding on to since the day the flag was placed in her hands. "I'm building something, Mom," she said. "Documentation, evidence. There are other girls this happened to before me, and I think we might actually have a real chance at making this stop." "Then you keep building it," Diane said, steadier now, some of her husband's old certainty rising up through her own voice in a way that startled Harper to hear. "And you call me every single day if you need to. Your father would have wanted you fighting for something bigger than yourself. He'd have wanted you safe while you did it too. Both things, not just one." "I'll be careful," Harper said. "You'd better be," Diane said. "I already buried one Doyle this year. I am not doing that twice." They stayed on the phone a long while after that, longer than usual, talking about nothing and everything the way they used to before grief made every conversation feel like it had to matter. When they finally hung up, Harper sat for a long time on the edge of her bed, looking at her father's photograph, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Not because the danger had lessened, because she wasn't carrying it entirely alone anymore. The following Tuesday, Coach Owens found himself walking past the athletics office bulletin board, the one with old rosters and photographs pinned up going back nearly 2 decades. The kind of wall nobody actually looks at anymore, except when they're passing time waiting for a meeting to start. He was early for a scheduling meeting, and out of habit more than anything else, his eyes drifted across the older photographs, team captains going back year after year, until something snagged his attention and wouldn't let go. It wasn't a football photograph at all. It was a framed newspaper clipping, faded almost yellow, tucked into the corner of the board from some long-ago community event, a joint fundraiser between the university and the local Marine Corps recruiting office. A handful of names underneath a group photograph of servicemen and coaching staff, shaking hands at a charity dinner, maybe 15 years old by now. Owens leaned in closer in there, third from the left, younger and leaner than he remembered him being. But unmistakably, him stood a Marine sergeant he hadn't thought about in years. Michael Doyle. They'd served together briefly more than a decade ago before Owens left the reserves to coach full-time. Doyle had been the kind of man other men naturally organized themselves around. Calm under pressure, sharper than his rank, sometimes suggested the sort of guy you wanted next to you if things went bad. Owens remembered a specific night on a training exercise gone sideways, weather turning fast, and Doyle keeping 4 younger soldiers calm and moving in the right direction, when panic would have been the easier response. He remembered thinking even back then that Doyle was the kind of man his own son should grow up to be like. He stood in front of that bulletin board for a long moment, his scheduling meeting completely forgotten, doing the math in his head. Doyle. Doyle. He thought of the new freshman everybody on the team had been whispering about, the one who'd turned down Wyatt Kessler in the cafeteria on her 4th day of school. He'd heard her last name mentioned once in passing by one of his assistant coaches and hadn't thought twice about it at the time. Harper Doyle. The room seemed to tilt slightly around him. He found her 2 days later, not by design exactly, though he'd been keeping half an eye out ever since the bulletin board. She was leaving the library a little after 7, backpack over one shoulder, and he called out to her from across the quad before he'd fully decided he was going to. "Miss Doyle, got a minute?" Harper turned, recognizing him vaguely as the football coach, though they'd never spoken before. "Sure," she said, cautious, in the particular way she'd become cautious about most adults connected even loosely to the football program. "I'm Coach Owens," he said, extending a hand. "I don't want to take much of your time. I just need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer." Okay. Your father, he said. Was his name Michael Doyle, Marine, 3rd Battalion? Harper went very still. Yes, she said slowly. How do you know that? Owens exhaled something in his shoulders, loosening slightly like he'd been holding a question for 2 days and could finally set it down. I served with him, he said, years back, before I started coaching full-time. He was a good man, one of the best I ever served alongside. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I heard about the training accident. I'm very sorry. I should have reached out sooner if I'd put the name together faster. Harper felt something complicated rise in her chest. Grief and surprise tangled together in a way that made it hard to speak for a second. Thank you for telling me, she managed finally. Nobody out here really knew him. It's strange hearing somebody say his name like that, like they actually remember him. I remember him, Owen said, vividly. He kept 4 scared kids calm during a training exercise that could have gone very badly one night out in the field when the weather turned on us fast. I've thought about that night more than once over the years. He hesitated, and something in his expression shifted harder to read. Listen, I know things haven't been easy for you here. I've heard some of it secondhand. I want you to know if you ever need anything, my door's open. Your father would have done the same for one of mine. Harper thanked him again, and they parted ways, but the conversation stayed with Owens long after she'd disappeared across the quad. It sat with him that night and the next morning at practice. And every time he looked at Wyatt Kessler running drills, something new and uncomfortable had attached itself to the way he saw his own quarterback. He thought about Renee Ashford, a name he hadn't let himself think about in almost a year. A Title IX complaint that had crossed his desk only briefly, secondhand before quietly disappearing into whatever process handled those things above his pay grade. He thought about how quickly the athletic department had announced new locker room funding right after that complaint closed. He thought about the tightness in Wyatt's jaw at practice a few weeks back when Owens had asked if something was going on with a girl. And he thought with a clarity that made him feel slightly sick to his stomach about a promise he'd made to himself a long time ago, standing in a field at night next to Sergeant Michael Doyle, that he'd never again be the kind of man who looked away from trouble just because looking away was easier. He hadn't kept that promise as well as he'd meant to. Not with Renee. Not yet with Harper. He decided standing on the practice field 2 days later, watching Wyatt overthrow yet another simple route, that he was done looking away. Meanwhile, the harassment against Harper hadn't slowed down. If anything, it had gotten quieter and more precise the way cruelty sometimes does once the people responsible for it start worrying about consequences. Tyler Reeves cornered her once in a stairwell close enough that she could smell the energy drink on his breath and told her low and almost friendly that she should really think about transferring somewhere that appreciated her more. Brandon Cole started a rumor in her chemistry class that she'd cheated on an exam, a rumor with no evidence behind it that nonetheless cost her 2 friendly acquaintances who suddenly stopped sitting near her. Harper wrote every incident down. She kept meeting Walter at his desk in the evenings, handing over copies of texts and screenshots, watching him file them away in a growing folder he kept locked in the bottom drawer alongside the security footage he still hadn't told anybody he'd saved. You building a case? Walter said one evening, more statement than question, looking over the latest addition to the folder. I don't know what else to call it, Harper admitted. Then you're doing it right, Walter said. Slow, careful, dated. That's how you build something that actually holds up instead of something that just makes you feel better for an afternoon. He closed the folder and looked at her for a long moment. Your father teach you that, the documentation part? He used to say information is ammunition, Harper said. Never fire until you have a clear shot. Something crossed Walter's face quick and difficult to name. Sounds like a man I'd have liked, he said quietly. Sounds like a man worth being the daughter of. He didn't tell her that night about his own son. He rarely told anybody about his own son. A young specialist named Cody Higgins, who never came home from a second deployment 11 years earlier. A boy Walter still sometimes reached for the phone to call, before he remembered halfway through dialing that there was nobody left on the other end of that number. He'd spent 11 years carrying a particular kind of guilt that never fully made sense even to him. The guilt of a father who couldn't protect his son from something no father could have stopped. And somewhere in the quiet space of that guilt, watching Harper Doyle carefully build her own case file night after night, Walter had started to feel something he hadn't expected to feel again. Useful, like the years hadn't been entirely wasted after all. He locked the folder back in his desk drawer that night and sat for a long moment afterward, just looking at it, thinking about a private named Ramirez he'd met years before retiring, and a story about a sergeant who threw himself into danger without hesitating, and a family that sergeant had left behind that Walter had never once in 8 months found the courage to reach out to directly. He'd told himself he didn't know how to say it right, that reaching out might only reopen something better left closed. Now here she was, anyway, standing in his hallway most evenings, needing exactly the kind of help he'd spent years wishing somebody had let him give. He wasn't going to waste this chance twice. 2 weeks after the coffee shop conversation with Renee, everything accelerated all at once. The way these things sometimes do, quiet pressure building underground, until it finally has nowhere left to go but up. It started with a call Coach Owens made one evening after practice to an old friend still working in the athletic department's compliance office. He didn't explain everything. He didn't need to. He just asked carefully whether the department had records going back a few years of any complaints involving Kessler, and whether those records had ever actually been reviewed by anyone outside the department itself. The answer he got back 2 days later in a nervous, hushed phone call from someone clearly worried about their own job security confirmed what he'd already begun to suspect. There had been 3 prior complaints. All 3 had been quietly closed. All 3 closures had come within weeks of new donations from the Kessler Family Foundation, donations large enough that nobody in the department had ever felt safe enough to ask the obvious question out loud. Owens sat with that information for a full day before he decided what to do with it. He thought about his career, 20 years built one recruiting class at a time, and what it would mean to put that at risk. He thought about his own son, a freshman himself now, at a different school entirely, and what kind of man he wanted his son to become. And he thought again and again about a field at night, and a sergeant who'd kept 4 scared kids calm because it was the right thing to do, not because it was the safe thing to do. He reached out to Harper the next day, catching her outside her dormitory before her morning class. "I need to tell you something," he said, glancing around the mostly empty walkway before continuing, his voice lower than usual. "And once I tell you, I can't take it back. So I need you to understand what you're about to be holding." "Okay," Harper said carefully. "There have been complaints before," Owen said, "against Wyatt. At least 3 that I know of going back before you ever set foot on this campus. All of them got closed out quietly. All of them got closed out right around the time new money showed up from his father's foundation." He paused, watching her absorb that. "I can't prove the 2 things are connected. Not in a courtroom sense. But I've been in institutions long enough to know what a pattern looks like when I see one, and this is a pattern." Harper felt her pulse quicken. "Renee told me some of this," she said. "About her own complaint. About 2 other girls." "Then you already had a piece of it," Owen said. "I'm giving you another piece. There might be more pieces out there than either of us has found yet. But somebody needs to start putting them together where people who actually have the power to act on it can see the whole picture at once. Why are you telling me instead of going to the administration yourself?" Owens was quiet for a moment, something tired and honest moving behind his eyes. "Because I've watched this administration protect that family for years," he said, quietly, carefully, in ways that never quite look like protection from the outside. If I go to them alone with what I know, there's a real chance it gets buried again the same way everything else has. But if there's enough pressure, enough documented pattern, enough people willing to say this happened to me too, that's a lot harder to make disappear." He looked at her steadily. "You've been building a file. I know Walter's been helping you. Keep building it. And when the time comes, I'll stand behind what I know publicly, whatever that costs me." Harper thought of her father, of the phrase he'd repeated to her 100 times growing up. Never fire until you have a clear shot. She was starting for the first time since arriving at Ridgemont to feel like a clear shot might actually be within reach. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me, for trusting me with this." "Don't thank me yet," Owen said, echoing, without knowing it, almost the exact words Renee had used weeks earlier. "Thank me once we've actually gotten somewhere." The following week, everything Wyatt Kessler had been carefully not thinking about finally caught up with him all at once in the worst possible way, in front of the worst possible audience. His father called him on a Tuesday night, the call Wyatt had been dreading, without fully admitting to himself that he'd been dreading it. Marcus Kessler didn't waste time with small talk. "I heard Coach Owens has been asking questions in compliance." Marcus said, his voice carrying the particular flat coldness Wyatt had learned over 19 years meant real trouble. "About old complaints, about you." "Dad, I don't know what he's—" "Don't." Marcus cut him off. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know exactly what this is about. I've spent 3 years and a great deal of money making sure this university understands the value of keeping the Kessler name clean. If that girl and her little friends manage to unravel that, everything I've built for this family, your scholarship, your draft prospects, the connections I've spent your entire life cultivating, all of it goes up in smoke. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Then fix it," Marcus said. "I don't care how. This ends now, and it ends quietly, and it ends in a way that makes that girl regret ever setting foot on that campus. Are we clear?" Wyatt hung up the phone with his hands shaking. Not entirely sure anymore whether the anger boiling in his chest was aimed at Harper or at his father or at some deeper, older exhaustion he'd never once let himself examine too closely. He'd spent his whole life being handed problems to solve exactly this way. Cruelty dressed up as necessity, and some small buried part of him hated how easily he still reached for it. He didn't examine that part too closely either. It was easier not to. Wednesday night, the night before everything came to a head, Harper couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her dorm room, running through everything that had happened in the last 3 weeks, feeling a strange, settled certainty building in her chest that something was about to break loose one way or another. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep entirely and went down to the fitness room, pulling on the same worn t-shirt and shorts she'd trained in almost every night since arriving at Ridgemont. The heavy bag hung in its usual corner, patient and waiting. And Harper worked through her forms slowly at first, then faster, her breathing finding its rhythm the way it always did, until the rest of the world fell away. And there was nothing left but the bag and her own steady hands. Walter found her there a little after 1 in the morning, making his rounds, and he stood in the doorway for a while without saying anything, just watching. When she finally stopped breathing hard, sweat soaking through her shirt, he stepped inside. "Something's coming tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know," Harper admitted. "It feels like it. Wyatt's been different this week. Angrier. Cornered." "Cornered men do stupid things," Walter said. "That's usually when they finally show everybody exactly who they've been the whole time." He crossed his arms, studying her. "You scared?" Harper thought about it honestly before answering. "A little," she said. "Not of him exactly. Of what happens after if it comes to something physical. Of whether people will believe I didn't start it." "You let me worry about the after," Walter said. "That's what all this documentation has been for. Every piece of paper in that folder, every hour of footage I've been keeping safe, all of it's there, so that if something happens, the truth doesn't depend on who shouts loudest afterward." He paused. "Your father ran into danger to protect 4 scared kids because it was right, not because he knew for certain how it would end. You come from that. Whatever happens tomorrow, you're not walking into it without people behind you. Me, Renee, Coach Owens, more than you probably realize." Harper felt something steady settle into place in her chest. The same steadiness she used to feel standing across from her father on their garage mats. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Get some sleep if you can," Walter said, turning to go. Whatever tomorrow brings, you'll want your head clear for it. She didn't sleep much, but she lay back down feeling less alone than she had in weeks, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning, exhaustion finally pulled her under anyway. Thursday morning came in gray and overcast, a light rain that never quite committed to falling properly. The kind of morning that felt in hindsight like the whole campus had been holding its breath for it. Harper dressed carefully. She chose a jacket her father had given her for her 17th birthday. The last gift he'd ever given her. Soft gray cotton she'd worn maybe a dozen times since he died. Because putting it on always felt like carrying a small piece of him with her. She needed that today. She didn't fully know why yet, only that some instinct, some quiet certainty settling low in her chest told her this was a day she'd want him close. The main hallway of Ashwood Hall was strangely crowded for 7:45 in the morning. Students lined both sides more than usual. Phones already out in a way that made Harper's stomach tighten before she even understood why. Word travels fast on a campus like Ridgemont, and somehow through channels she'd never fully traced word had gotten out that something was coming. She saw Wyatt at the far end of the hallway, Tyler and Brandon flanking him, spread just wide enough to make the space feel smaller than it was to close off the easy paths around them. There were no professors in sight, no campus security nearby, except she noticed with a small flicker of relief, Walter standing near the far exit doors, watching everything with the stillness of a man who had been trained a long time ago to notice exactly this kind of moment. Harper stopped 20 feet away. "The princess finally shows up," Wyatt said loud enough for the whole hallway to hear, though his voice had an edge to it that hadn't been there in the cafeteria 3 weeks earlier. Something raw. Something closer to desperate. "What do you want, Wyatt? What do I want?" He stepped closer, and she could see now up close how tired he looked. How something underneath the practiced charm had worn almost completely through. "I want this to be over. I want you gone. I want my life back." "Then leave me alone," Harper said. That's all it would have taken, from the very first day. "You made this happen," Wyatt snapped. "You and your little friends going around whispering to Coach Owens, to compliance, to whoever else will listen. You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a girl with a dead father playing dress-up in his belt, thinking that makes you special." The hallway went absolutely silent. Somewhere behind her, Harper heard someone whisper, "Oh no, he didn't." Something in Harper's chest went very cold and very still. The same stillness she'd felt reading the obituary someone had slid under her door weeks earlier. The stillness that came right before she decided something important. "Don't talk about my father," she said quiet enough that people had to lean in slightly to hear it, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. "Why not?" Wyatt pressed, stepping even closer now, close enough that she could smell the sharp mix of cologne and nervous sweat coming off him. "He's dead. He can't protect you from here. Probably ran straight into whatever killed him, just like you're running straight into me right now, thinking bravery is the same thing as being smart." "My father was a hero," Harper said, her voice steady despite the fury building underneath it. "He saved 4 people the night he died." "You don't get to say his name." "Then where is he now?" Wyatt said. "Because it's just you standing here, all alone." Harper turned to walk away from him, the way she'd walked away from him 3 weeks ago in the cafeteria. The same move that had started all of this in the first place. She'd almost cleared his shoulder when his hand shot out and grabbed the collar of her jacket, spinning her back around hard enough that she stumbled against the lockers behind her. "I'm not done with you," he said. And something in his voice had gone past anger now into something uglier. Something that scared even some of the people watching. His hands closed around the front of her jacket. "Let's see what's under the little hero act," he said and yanked. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the hallway like something breaking that couldn't be unbroken. The jacket ripped from her shoulder down to her elbow. The soft gray cotton her father had given her, splitting open in front of 200 phones already recording. Someone in the crowd gasped. Someone else screamed. But Harper didn't cry. She didn't cover herself. She didn't run. Instead, everything in her body shifted at once the way it had 1,000 times in a garage back in Ohio, the way her father had drilled into her since she was 9 years old. Her stance widened, weight settling low and balanced between both feet. Her breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat instead of racing ahead of it. Her hands rose into position, and anyone close enough could see the faint calluses across her knuckles, the marks of years spent hitting something harder than air. "My father," she said, and her voice carried clean across the frozen hallway, "was a United States Marine. He served 2 tours overseas. He died saving 4 soldiers who panicked during a live fire exercise, and he taught me that violence is always, always the last resort." Wyatt laughed, but it came out thin and unsteady now. "So what? You gonna karate chop me?" "No," Harper said. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away right now." The hallway held its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Wyatt's pride made the decision for him, the same pride that had built and ruined most of his life up to that point. He lunged forward, hands reaching for her again. Everything slowed down. Harper pivoted on her back foot, her arm sweeping up in a clean, practiced arc, the edge of her hand connecting with the side of Wyatt's neck, with the precision of something rehearsed 10,000 times in a garage nobody at Ridgemont would ever see. His eyes went wide, then confused, then empty. And Wyatt Kessler, starting quarterback, golden boy, king of a kingdom. His father had built for him, dropped straight down onto the hallway floor with a sound that echoed off the lockers. Silence. Then chaos. Tyler roared and charged from her left. Brandon came from the right. They'd made the same mistake Wyatt had made, assuming the quiet girl with the torn jacket was still the same girl who'd walked away from a cafeteria 3 weeks ago without fighting back. Harper dropped into a low stance, waiting. Tyler reached her first, throwing a wild, heavy swing that would have flattened most people caught by it. Harper ducked underneath, caught his wrist, and used his own forward momentum to flip him hard over her hip. He crashed into the wall beside a water fountain with a crack that could have been the fountain, or could have been something in his shoulder. Brandon grabbed for her from behind, and she drove an elbow back into him, spun, and swept his legs out from under him in one clean motion. He hit the floor, gasping all the air punched out of him at once. 3 seconds. 3 young men down. 200 witnesses' phones held perfectly steady, now capturing every second of it. Harper stood in the center of the hallway, her torn jacket hanging from one shoulder, breathing steady, hands still raised out of habit more than necessity. She looked out at the crowd, many of whom had watched her get harassed for 3 straight weeks without once stepping in to help. "Anyone else?" she asked quietly. Nobody moved. Somewhere down the hallway, sirens had already started, faint and rising, someone having called for help the second the first punch never actually needed to be thrown. Walter was already moving through the crowd toward her, his radio in hand, his face carrying an expression somewhere between relief and grim, focused purpose. Harper looked down at Wyatt, still on the ground, beginning to stir now, groaning softly, and she felt something settle inside her that hadn't been settled in 8 long months. Not triumph exactly. Something steadier than that. Something closer to her father's voice, finally fully at peace with what she'd become. She reached up and pulled the torn edges of her jacket back over her shoulder, covering herself now that there was nothing left to prove by not doing so, and turned to face whatever was coming next. It came fast. Campus police pushing through the crowd within minutes. Paramedics close behind them, checking on Wyatt and Tyler and Brandon, while students pressed in from every direction, some recording, some crying, some already whispering the story into their phones to friends who hadn't been there to see it themselves. An officer approached Harper with one hand resting near his belt, cautious, unsure yet which version of this scene he was walking into. Harper raised both hands slowly, calm and clear. "I was defending myself," she said. "Check every phone in this hallway. Check the security footage from the last 3 weeks. I have documentation going back to my first month here, and I want to press charges." The hallway erupted around her students, shouting, a few professors finally arriving breathless at the edges of the crowd, chaos spreading in every direction at once. But Harper Doyle stood perfectly still in the middle of it, in her torn jacket, with 3 young men on the floor around her, and 200 witnesses at her back, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Ridgemont University, trying so hard to disappear, she understood with absolute certainty that she never would again. Somewhere in a locked drawer down the hall, a hard drive full of camera footage waited to finally be handed over. Somewhere across campus, a coach was already dialing the number of the compliance office he'd called 2 weeks earlier, ready to say out loud and on the record everything he'd been carrying quietly for years. And somewhere off campus, in a house built on careful, expensive silence, a phone was about to start ringing in a way that no amount of money was going to be able to stop. The fight in that hallway had lasted 3 seconds. What came after it was going to take a great deal longer. Renee heard about it before she even reached the building, the way news like that outruns everyone arriving secondhand through 3 different panicked texts, before she rounded the corner and saw the crowd still gathered, the flashing lights reflecting off wet pavement outside. She pushed through until she found Harper still standing near the lockers, a paramedic checking a small scrape on her arm, while an officer waited patiently a few feet away. "You okay?" Renee asked, breathless. "I'm okay," Harper said, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she actually meant it completely. Renee looked past her at Wyatt being helped onto a stretcher, at Tyler holding his shoulder and swearing under his breath, at Brandon sitting against the wall with his head between his knees. "They're going to say you started it," Renee said quietly. "That's what they always say." "Not this time," Harper said, and nodded toward Walter, who was already speaking with the responding officers, a small flash drive held carefully in one hand. 3 weeks of proof. Whatever happens next, at least it happens with the truth, sitting right in the middle of it. Coach Owens arrived minutes later, still in his practice gear, having sprinted the whole way once word reached the athletic complex. He took one look at the scene, at Wyatt on the stretcher, at Harper, standing steady in the middle of it all, and something settled in his face that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of a man who has finally stopped waiting for the right moment and simply let the moment arrive on its own. "I already called compliance," he told Harper quietly, stepping close enough that only she could hear him. "Before I even got here. Told them everything. Every complaint, every closure, every donation that lined up a little too neatly. It's out of my hands now, and I'm glad for it." Harper nodded, unable to find words steady enough yet to answer him properly. Her mother's name lit up her phone screen a few minutes later. Someone from the dorm, having already posted video that had impossibly made its way 6 hours north before Harper had even finished giving her statement to campus police. She answered with shaking hands. "Mom, I saw the video." Diane said, her voice tight with fear and something else underneath it. Something that sounded almost like pride fighting its way through the panic. "Are you hurt? Tell me the truth." "I'm not hurt," Harper said. "I promise. I'm okay." There was a long pause on the line, her mother's breathing audible and unsteady. "Your father would be so proud of you right now," Diane finally said. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to hear it." Harper closed her eyes, standing in that torn jacket in the middle of a hallway, still buzzing with sirens and static and 200 students who would never quite look at her the same way again, and let herself just for a moment believe it. 3 seconds had ended one part of her story. What came next would take a great deal longer, and it was only just beginning. The Kessler family lawyer arrived on campus less than 18 hours after the video started spreading online, which told you something about how these things usually got handled and how fast money could move when it needed to. His name was Grant Ellison, a tall, unhurried man in a gray suit that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent. And he set up shop in a reserved conference room at the university's administration building, like he'd done this exact thing before. Because he had. Twice, in fact, over the last 3 years, though, almost nobody outside a very small circle knew that yet. Harper sat across a long table from him. 2 days later, her mother beside her, having driven the 6 hours through the night the moment she heard what happened. Walter sat on Harper's other side, not as a lawyer, not officially anything at all, just there, because Harper had asked him to be, and because he'd told her flatly that he wasn't about to let her walk into that room without somebody who already knew the whole story sitting next to her. Across the table, Marcus Kessler sat with his arms folded, his son beside him, looking pale and diminished in a way that didn't match the boy who'd torn Harper's jacket 4 days earlier. Wyatt had a soft brace around his neck, more precaution than necessity, according to the hospital report, and he hadn't said a single word since walking in. "Let's be direct." Ellison began, opening a leather folder with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who billed by the hour. "My client's son sustained a concussion and soft tissue trauma to his cervical spine. 2 other students were injured as well, one with a fractured shoulder blade, the other with significant bruising to the ribs. This university has video footage taken by dozens of bystanders, clearly showing Miss Doyle striking 3 separate individuals in rapid succession. After your client tore her jacket in front of 200 witnesses," Diane Doyle said sharply before Harper could respond herself. "After grabbing her arm hard enough to leave bruises the week before. After weeks of documented harassment that this office has apparently done nothing about." "Alleged harassment," Ellison corrected smoothly. "We've seen no formal complaint filed prior to this incident." "Because I was building a case," Harper said, her voice steady, "the way you're supposed to. I have 3 weeks of dated timestamp documentation, screenshots, photographs, a report on my slashed tires, a note left under my door referencing my father's death. I have witnesses. I have security footage that your client's family apparently believed had conveniently disappeared." The room went very still. Marcus Kessler's eyes flicked just barely toward his lawyer, a small involuntary movement that Harper caught and filed away, in the same careful part of her mind that had been filing away everything for 3 weeks. "That footage was corrupted," Marcus said a shade too quickly. "A known system malfunction. It's on record with campus security." Diane Doyle leaned forward, her voice low and steady, in a way Harper hadn't heard from her mother in months. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "my husband died protecting soldiers who trusted him with their lives. My daughter has spent the last 3 weeks documenting in careful detail everything your son and his friends did to her. I would be very careful sitting in this room about what you decide to call convenient." Ellison cleared his throat, attempting to steer the conversation back onto firmer ground. "With respect, Mrs. Doyle allegations aren't evidence. We're happy to let the appropriate university process play out. But I'd caution against framing this as anything more than a physical altercation between students when your daughter, by her own admission, escalated with martial arts training." "She defended herself," Diane said. "After 3 weeks of harassment, this university apparently did nothing to stop. If that's escalation, then every person who has ever protected themselves from harm is guilty of the same thing." Wyatt shifted slightly in his seat, the brace around his neck making the movement look stiffer than it probably was. He hadn't spoken once since walking in, and something about his silence had started to feel less like arrogance and more like exhaustion, though Harper wasn't yet sure which one it actually was. "It's on record as a malfunction," Walters said, speaking for the first time, his voice low and even. "That's what the primary system logged. What it doesn't know is that the backup drive kept its own separate copy the way backup drives are designed to do, and that copy was never touched." He set his hands flat on the table. "I pulled it myself the night the tires got slashed because something about that malfunction didn't sit right with me. I've had it locked up safe ever since." The dean overseeing the meeting, a careful gray-haired woman named Dr. Alvarez, who had so far said very little, leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Higgins," she said, "are you telling this room you're currently in possession of unreviewed security footage relevant to this incident?" "I am," Walter said. 3 hours of it from the exact window in question, showing exactly who accessed that parking lot that evening and exactly what they did while they were there." Ellison's expression didn't change, not visibly, but something in the room's temperature shifted anyway. The particular chill that settles when a carefully built story starts to show its first real crack. "I'd like that footage reviewed formally," Dr. Alvarez said, "before this meeting goes any further." "Of course," Marcus Kessler said smoothly, recovering fast. "We have nothing to hide." Harper watched Wyatt during that exchange, watched something flicker across his face, brief and unguarded. Something that looked almost like relief. He said nothing. But for the first time since she'd met him, Harper thought she saw underneath all the practiced arrogance a boy who was tired of carrying a story he'd never fully chosen for himself. The meeting adjourned without resolution, both sides agreeing to reconvene once the footage had been formally reviewed. But Harper walked out of that room feeling something shift underneath her feet, something she hadn't felt in 3 weeks. The ground was finally starting to move in her direction. That evening, Coach Owens called Dr. Alvarez's office, directly requesting a private meeting, and what he told her in that meeting would end up changing the shape of everything that came after. He laid it out carefully, methodically, the way you'd expect from a man who'd spent 20 years breaking down game film for a living. 3 prior Title IX complaints against Wyatt Kessler, going back 2 full years before Harper ever arrived on campus. All 3 closed within weeks, sometimes days, of new contributions from the Kessler Family Foundation. A locker room renovation that lined up almost exactly with Renee Ashford's closure letter. A new athletic scholarship endowment that appeared 6 months after the second complaint quietly disappeared. I want to be clear about something, Owens told Dr. Alvarez, his voice steady, despite what the conversation was costing him personally. I've coached this program for 11 years. I've watched this pattern happen more than once, and I told myself every single time that it wasn't my place to ask questions. I was wrong. I should have said something the first time. I'm saying it now. Dr. Alvarez sat quietly for a long moment after he finished, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. You understand what you're putting at risk telling me this? She said finally. Your position here, possibly your entire career. I understand, Owen said. I've thought about that a great deal this past week. He paused, something old and heavy moving behind his eyes. I served with a Marine sergeant years ago named Michael Doyle. Good man. The kind of man who threw himself into danger without stopping to calculate what it might cost him first, because it was the right thing to do, and that was the only math that mattered to him. He looked directly at Dr. Alvarez. His daughter is a student here now. I owe that man more than my silence. I owe him better than that. By Friday morning, the review of Walter's footage had confirmed exactly what he'd suspected all along. The recording showed with unmistakable clarity Tyler Reeves and Brandon Cole approaching Harper's car with a folding knife, kneeling beside each tire in turn, glancing around nervously before disappearing back toward the dormitory. It showed, in a separate frame from earlier that evening, someone entering the security office's utility closet roughly 40 minutes before the malfunction began. Someone whose build and gait matched unmistakably campus security's own night supervisor. A man named Russell Doss, who, as it happened, had received a substantial and previously unexplained cash deposit into his personal account exactly 9 days later. The pattern Owens had described and the physical evidence Walter had protected were suddenly sitting in the same room together, and neither one on its own would have been nearly as damning as the 2 of them combined. Dr. Alvarez called an emergency meeting of the university's disciplinary board for the following Monday. News moved fast after that, the way it always does once the first real crack in a story appears. Renee Ashford heard about the footage review through a friend in the compliance office and called Harper that same evening, her voice trembling with something Harper hadn't heard from her before. Hope. They're actually looking at it, Renee said. After a year of nothing, they're actually looking at it. Owens went to them too, Harper said. Told them everything, about the complaints, the timing, all of it. There was a long pause on the line. I want to testify, Renee said finally, her voice steadier now, more certain. If there's a hearing, I want to say what happened to me out loud in front of whoever needs to hear it. I've spent this whole year wishing I'd been brave enough to keep pushing after that closure letter. I'm not making that mistake again. You don't have to, Harper said gently. I know what it costs. I know I don't have to, Renee said. I want to. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to call the other 2. The girl who graduated last year and the one who transferred out sophomore year. I think if there's ever going to be a moment where this actually sticks, it's this one. I don't want to let it pass by staying quiet again. Over the following 2 days, Renee made those calls. The first, a young woman named Kayla Bishop, now working in Dallas, agreed almost immediately, telling Renee she'd been waiting 2 years for someone to finally ask. The second call took longer. The girl who'd transferred out, a former sophomore named Priya Malhotra, had built a careful, quiet life for herself at a different school entirely, and the idea of reopening any of it terrified her. But after a long conversation and a promise from Renee that she wouldn't be doing it alone, Priya agreed to submit a written statement, even if she couldn't bring herself to appear in person. By Sunday night, Dr. Alvarez's office had 3 separate accounts spanning 2 years describing a pattern of behavior from Wyatt Kessler that ran directly alongside a pattern of quiet institutional cover-up that ran even longer. Marcus Kessler, hearing about the growing case against his son through his lawyer late Sunday evening, did what men like Marcus Kessler had always done when a problem grew larger than money alone could handle. He escalated. He called the university's president, directly bypassing Dr. Alvarez's office entirely, reminding him in careful, measured language of exactly how much the Kessler Family Foundation had contributed to Ridgemont over the past decade, and exactly how easily that relationship could end. He mentioned, almost casually, that other universities across the state had expressed interest in similar partnerships. Universities that might appreciate the Kessler name a bit more than Ridgemont apparently did right now. It was in every way that mattered a threat dressed up carefully enough to survive a lawsuit if anyone ever tried to call it one directly. The university president, a man named Dr. Franklin Reyes, who had spent the better part of 15 years building relationships with donors, exactly like Marcus Kessler, found himself for the first time in a long while, having to choose between 2 things he'd never expected to have to weigh against each other so directly: the institution's finances, the institution's conscience. He called Dr. Alvarez into his office Monday morning, 2 hours before the disciplinary hearing was set to begin. "I need to understand exactly what we're walking into," he told her, "before this becomes something neither of us can control." Dr. Alvarez laid it all out for him calmly, methodically. The footage, the pattern of prior complaints, Coach Owens' statement, the 3 accounts from Renee, Kayla, and Priya, the suspicious payment to the night security supervisor. By the time she finished, Dr. Franklin Reyes sat quietly for a long moment, looking older than he had when the conversation started. "If we bury this," he said slowly, "and it ever comes out that we buried it with this much evidence sitting in front of us, it won't just cost us the Kessler donation. It will cost us everything. Every parent who ever trusted us with their daughter." "Yes," Dr. Alvarez said simply. Reyes was quiet another moment. Then he straightened his shoulders, the particular posture of a man making a decision he should have made a long time ago. "Then we do this the right way," he said. "No matter what it costs us. Michael Doyle's daughter deserves that much from this institution, and so did every girl before her." The disciplinary hearing convened at 2 o'clock that afternoon in a formal boardroom on the top floor of the administration building. 5 members of the university's conduct board seated behind a long table, Dr. Alvarez presiding. Harper sat with her mother and Walter on one side of the room. Wyatt sat with his father and Grant Ellison on the other, Tyler and Brandon, a row behind them, both facing their own separate but related hearings later that same week. Before the first witness was called, Dr. Alvarez addressed the room briefly, laying out how the hearing would proceed, the order of testimony, the standard of evidence the board would weigh. Diane Doyle sat with her hand resting lightly on Harper's knee, throughout a small, steadying pressure that Harper found herself grateful for more than once over the following 2 hours. "For what it's worth," Diane whispered to her daughter just before the first witness was called, "your father used to say the hardest part of any fight isn't throwing the punch. It's standing still long enough to let the truth land where it needs to." Harper nodded, holding on to that thought like a handrail. Coach Owens testified first, laying out everything he'd already told Dr. Alvarez, his voice steady even as he described in careful detail the pattern of donations and closures he'd uncovered over the past 2 weeks. When Ellison pressed him sharp and aggressive about whether he had any direct proof the donations and closures were connected, Owens answered without flinching. "I don't have a signed confession, if that's what you're asking," he said. "What I have is 11 years of institutional memory, and a pattern so consistent it stopped looking like coincidence a long time ago. I also have my own conscience, which I ignored a year longer than I should have. I'm not ignoring it today." Walter testified next, presenting the footage formally, walking the board through exactly what it showed frame by frame. The tires, the utility closet. The timeline matched precisely against the payment records the university's own finance office had pulled overnight once Dr. Reyes gave the order. Then Renee stood and told her story from the beginning, steady even when her voice shook slightly in the middle of it, describing a night just over a year earlier that had shaped everything since. Kayla Bishop's written statement was read into the record after her, and then Priya Malhotra's, each account echoing the others in details too specific and too consistent to be coincidence. By the time it was Harper's turn to speak, the room had gone very quiet. The particular quiet of people who had already heard enough to know which direction the truth was pointing, even before the last witness finished. One board member, an older professor named Dr. Whitcomb, who had sat mostly silent through the earlier testimony, leaned forward before Harper began. "Miss Doyle," he said gently, "before you speak, I want you to know this board has read every page of your documentation twice over. We understand the weight of what you're about to describe. Take whatever time you need." Harper nodded, grateful for the small kindness, and stood. Harper stood and told her own story clearly, without embellishment, the same way she'd learned to tell any hard truth plainly and completely. The cafeteria, the fake account, the tires. The obituary slid under her door. The hallway, and what it had finally cost her to stand her ground in it. "My father taught me that violence is always the last resort," she said near the end, looking directly at Wyatt for the first time since the hearing began. "Not the first one, the last one. I gave you the chance to walk away. You made the choice that put you on that floor. I've had to live with the choices other people made about me for 8 months now, ever since my father died protecting people who never even got the chance to thank him for it properly. I'm done letting other people's choices decide who I get to be." Wyatt didn't meet her eyes while she spoke. He stared at the table in front of him, his jaw working slightly, and when Dr. Alvarez asked if he wished to respond to anything said, he shook his head once and said nothing at all. The silence somehow saying more than any defense his lawyer could have offered on his behalf. Marcus Kessler tried one final time to shift the conversation, standing up sharply, his voice rising. "This is a smear campaign," he said. "Coordinated, timed, clearly designed to—" "Mr. Kessler," Dr. Reyes said quietly from the back of the room, where he'd been sitting silently the entire hearing. "I would sit down now, if I were you." Something in his tone made Marcus actually stop talking. It was the first time in 3 years of careful institutional pressure that anyone at Ridgemont had told him no and clearly meant it. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, their decision was unanimous. Wyatt Kessler was expelled from Ridgemont University, effective immediately. His scholarship revoked, his standing with the football program terminated. Tyler Reeves and Brandon Cole received 1-year suspensions, each pending separate hearings for their own roles in the vandalism and harassment. Russell Doss, the night security supervisor, was terminated and referred to local police for further investigation into the falsified footage and the payment tied to it. The university's relationship with the Kessler Family Foundation was formally and publicly dissolved within the week. The locker room plaque bearing the family name came down within the month, quietly, without ceremony. Exactly the kind of quiet the family had once used to make its problems disappear, now turned back around against them. The fallout reached further than campus. Marcus Kessler's real estate company had spent years cultivating a careful public image built partly around family values and community investment. Sponsoring youth sports leagues, funding scholarships, appearing at charity dinners with the same practiced warmth he'd once shown reporters covering his son's football career. That image cracked wide open once local news outlets picked up the full story, connecting the dots between the donations, the closures, and the pattern Coach Owens had finally been brave enough to describe out loud. 3 of his company's biggest commercial tenants quietly declined to renew their leases that spring, citing unrelated business reasons that fooled almost nobody. A youth football league he'd sponsored for 6 years removed his name from their annual banquet without public comment. He was quietly asked to step down from 2 community boards he'd sat on for over a decade, boards that had once been proud to list his name in their annual reports. Marcus Kessler never publicly admitted wrongdoing. Men like him rarely do. But by the following autumn, the Kessler name that had once opened every door in 3 counties had started slowly and unmistakably to close a few of them. Instead, a quiet reckoning built, not from any single dramatic moment, but from dozens of smaller ones. Each person who'd once looked away finally deciding not to anymore. Coach Owens kept his job, though, not without consequence. The board noted formally that he should have raised concerns years earlier and issued a written reprimand alongside their thanks for finally coming forward. Owens accepted both without complaint. "Better late than never," he told Harper afterward. Though I know that's a hollow thing to say to the girls who waited far too long for late to finally show up. Wyatt left campus quietly 2 days after the hearing, most of his belongings packed into boxes by a moving crew his father hired rather than by Wyatt himself. Harper heard secondhand through Coach Owens that he hadn't spoken to his father in the week since the decision came down, the 2 of them barely exchanging words during the drive home. Owens mentioned almost in passing that the silence between father and son on that drive had apparently stretched the entire 6 hours, neither one willing to be the first to say anything at all. She didn't see him again before he left. But she received almost a month later a short letter, handwritten and unsigned, except for his initials forwarded to her through the athletic department after he apparently couldn't find any other way to reach her that felt right. "I'm not writing this to ask for anything," it read. "I know I don't get to ask you for anything. I just needed to say it somewhere, even if it's just on paper you might throw away. I spent my whole life being handed problems and being taught money makes them disappear. I never had to think about what it cost other people for those problems to disappear. I'm in counseling now, mandatory. But I think I'd have needed it either way, eventually, if I'd ever let myself actually look at what I'd been doing. I'm not asking to be forgiven. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what I did was wrong, not just what it cost me." Harper read it twice, sitting on the edge of her bed, feeling something complicated move through her that she hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not yet, maybe not ever fully. But something adjacent to it, a small, cautious acknowledgement that people could sometimes slowly, painfully, begin to see themselves clearly for the first time. She didn't write back. She wasn't ready for that, and wasn't sure she ever would be. But she kept the letter folded carefully in the same drawer where she'd once kept a growing folder of evidence, a strange and unexpected coda to a story she'd thought was already finished. News of the hearing spread beyond campus within days, first through local outlets, then further as video of the original hallway confrontation continued circulating online, now paired with the full context of everything that had led up to it. Reporters called the university's press office asking for comment. A few tried calling Harper directly, numbers she didn't recognize showing up on her phone at odd hours, and she let almost all of them go to voicemail, unsure yet what she wanted to say publicly, if anything at all. What she did know, with growing certainty over the following weeks, was that she didn't want this to end with punishment alone. Punishment was necessary. It wasn't enough. She thought about Renee and Kayla and Priya, 3 women who'd spent years believing nobody would ever actually listen. She thought about the freshman girls she saw around campus, now walking a little closer together than they used to, glancing over their shoulders in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of herself 3 months earlier. She thought about her father standing over a field of scared young soldiers, choosing to protect them instead of simply surviving alongside them. 3 weeks after the hearing, Harper posted a single flyer on the community board outside the student center. Self-defense fundamentals. Thursday, 6 o'clock campus recreation gym. Open to everyone, no experience necessary. She expected maybe a dozen people to show up the first week. 43 did. She stood in front of them, in a plain t-shirt and workout pants, her father's black belt tied carefully around her waist. Feeling nervous in a way she hadn't expected to feel more nervous than she'd been standing in that hallway 3 weeks earlier. My father taught me that violence is never the first answer. She began, her voice carrying clearly across the crowded gym. But he also taught me that when every other option has been taken away from you, when the people who are supposed to protect you fail to, you have every right to protect yourself. That's not aggression. That's not looking for a fight. That's just refusing to be helpless, when helplessness is the only thing anybody's offered you. She taught them basics first, the same basics her father had taught her in a garage back in Ohio, years before any of this began. How to break a grip, how to create distance, how to fall without getting hurt, how to yell loud enough and specifically enough that people around you actually understood you needed help, instead of assuming it was a joke. But more than the physical techniques she taught them, something else, something harder to put into words, but easier somehow to demonstrate simply by standing in front of them, week after week, steady and certain. She taught them that silence wasn't safety, that documentation mattered, that asking for help early and often wasn't weakness, it was strategy. The most powerful thing you can do, she told them during a water break one Thursday evening, is refuse to stay quiet. They count on our silence. They count on our shame, our fear, our doubt about whether anyone will believe us. We're done giving them that. Word of the class spread fast. By the third week, they'd moved to a larger space, the recreation center's main gymnasium, and Coach Owens had started quietly sending some of his own players to sit in as volunteer assistants, a small, deliberate way of trying to rebuild something he felt he'd let erode for years without noticing. Among the regulars was a quiet freshman named Ivy Whitfield, who showed up to that very first session, unable to make eye contact with anyone in the room, standing near the back wall for almost the entire hour, before finally hesitantly joining a partner drill in the last 10 minutes. She came back the second week, and the third. By the 6th week, she was one of the first to volunteer whenever Harper needed a demonstration partner. Something in her posture straightening out session by session in a way that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with something quieter underneath it. There was also a graduate student named Marisol Ortiz, older than most of the others who'd enrolled the week after a frightening encounter walking home from the library one night. An encounter that hadn't turned into anything worse, only by luck rather than preparation. She told Harper once after class that she'd spent years telling herself fear was just something women were supposed to carry quietly, a tax paid for existing in public space, and that watching Harper teach had been the first time she'd ever seriously considered that fear might be something you could actually train against instead of just endure. A handful of young men started showing up too. Brothers and boyfriends and friends who'd watched someone they loved carry that same quiet fear, and finally wanted a way to help carry it too, or at least understand it better. Harper welcomed all of them, teaching the same principles to everyone in the room. Awareness first. De-escalation always preferred. Physical response only when every other door had already closed. By the end of the semester, the class had grown from 43 students to well over 100, spilling out of the recreation gym on busy nights, a waiting list forming. For the first time, anyone at the rec center could remember for a class that didn't count toward a single credit. Harper started training 2 of her strongest students, Ivy among them, to help lead sessions themselves, passing forward the same steady, patient instruction her father had once given her in a garage that felt some nights like a whole lifetime ago. Walter came to every session standing near the door, the way he always had, not participating exactly. Just present the same steady presence he'd offered Harper from her very first week on campus. He'd started talking more openly about his son now. Harper noticed small mentions here and there, the beginning of a grief he'd apparently kept locked away for 11 years, finally finding somewhere safe enough to breathe. One evening after class, he handed her a small folded flag pin, the kind veterans sometimes carried worn soft with age. "This was Cody's," he said quietly. "My son. I've carried it a long time, not really knowing what to do with it." He pressed it gently into her hand. "I think he'd have liked knowing it ended up somewhere it could still do some good." Harper closed her hand around it, feeling the weight of it settle into her palm, understanding without either of them needing to say it directly exactly what Walter was trusting her with. "Thank you," she said. "I'll carry it well." "I know you will," Walter said. "You've been carrying things well since the day I met you." The semester ended, with Wyatt Kessler's expulsion, still making occasional headlines, the story having grown over the following months into something larger than any single hallway confrontation. 2 other universities across the region, hearing about the pattern uncovered at Ridgemont, quietly launched their own internal reviews of donor-related disciplinary closures. A ripple effect nobody had planned, but that nonetheless kept spreading one uncomfortable institutional conversation at a time. Renee graduated that spring, and before she left campus for good, she stopped by Harper's dorm room one last time. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not just for what happened in that hallway, for giving the rest of us a reason to finally say something." "You already had the courage," Harper said. "You just needed somewhere safe to put it." "Maybe," Renee said. "Or maybe sometimes courage needs company before it's willing to show up at all." She hugged Harper tightly, the kind of hug that carries a whole year of unsaid things inside it. "I'm going to keep an eye on this class, long after I'm gone, just so you know." "I'm counting on it," Harper said. On a quiet Saturday morning in late spring, almost a year to the day. Since her father's funeral, Harper prepared for the drive back to Ohio alone, her mother having offered to come along. "I think I need to do this one by myself, Mom." Harper had told her the night before, sitting together on the porch of the small house Diane had slowly, carefully turned back into a home over the past year. "Not because I don't want you there. Because I think there's something I need to say to him that I need to say without an audience, even you." Diane had been quiet for a moment, studying her daughter's face in the porch light. "You've grown into someone I don't think either of us expected you to become this fast," she said finally. "I used to worry those first few months after we lost him, that grief was going to swallow you whole. Instead, you turned it into something that's helping other people survive their own hard years." She reached over and squeezed Harper's hand. "Go say what you need to say. He'll hear it. I believe that more than I've believed almost anything this past year." "Thank you, Mom," Harper said, "for letting me carry this the way I needed to, for not trying to fix it for me." "That's not how you fix grief anyway," Diane said. "I learned that the hard way too. You just walk alongside somebody long enough that eventually they find their own way to carry it. That's all I've been trying to do since the day those officers showed up at our door." Harper hugged her mother tightly before heading inside to pack, feeling for the first time in a long while like the two of them had finally found solid ground together after a year of walking on something far less certain. The drive itself took most of the day, 6 hours of interstate that Harper spent mostly in comfortable silence. The radio low, her mind turning over everything from the past year in a slow, easy rhythm that felt less like reliving pain and more like finally being able to set it down somewhere safe. The cemetery sat on a low hill outside town, rows of white headstones catching the early morning light. Harper found her father's marker easily the way she always did, some quiet internal compass pointing her there, without needing to think about it. She knelt in the grass beside it, running her fingers briefly over the engraved letters of his name. "I finished my first year," she told him quietly, the way she'd told him everything, ever since he'd been gone. Some part of her still certain in whatever way certainty like that works, that he could hear her. "It wasn't the year either of us expected. But I think you'd have been proud of how it went. I think you'd have been proud of who I had to become to get through it." She told him about Wyatt and the hearing, and the 3 seconds in that hallway that changed everything. She told him about Renee and Kayla and Priya, women he'd never met, who had in their own ways become part of the story he'd started simply by teaching his daughter never to throw the first punch, but never to be afraid of the last one either. She told him about Walter and Coach Owens and the 43 students who'd shown up to a self-defense class on a Thursday night because they were tired of feeling powerless, and how that number had grown to over 100 by the end of the semester. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a new black belt, freshly earned, the fabric still stiff and unworn, and set it gently on the grass beside her father's headstone. "This one's mine," she said. "I earned it the hard way, same as you did. But I couldn't have earned it without everything you taught me first." The wind moved through the tall grass around her, warm and steady. And for a moment, just a moment, Harper let herself believe she could hear something underneath it. Some quiet echo of a voice she missed more than she knew how to say out loud. "You were always my hero, kid. Now you're theirs too." She sat there a long while longer, the sun climbing higher over the quiet rows of headstones, feeling something inside her finally settle into a kind of peace she hadn't expected to find so soon, if ever. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. A text from a freshman in her self-defense class, a girl named Ivy who'd shown up to the very first session, too scared to make eye contact with anyone in the room, now asking if Harper could help her start a similar program at her younger sister's high school back home. Harper smiled and typed back a single line. "Let's talk. You're not alone in this." Because that, in the end, was the real victory. Not the viral video, not the hearing, not even the belt resting quietly now on a grave 1,000 miles from where her story had first begun to change shape. It was the growing, stubborn, unbroken chain of people who had decided one at a time that silence wasn't the price they were willing to keep paying. It was a coach who finally spoke the truth he'd swallowed for years. A security guard who finally let an old grief become something useful again. A group of women who finally trusted each other enough to say the same thing at the same time together, instead of alone. And it was a girl who had come to Ridgemont University trying only to disappear, and instead, without ever quite meaning to, had become exactly the kind of person her father always believed she could be. She stood, brushed the grass from her knees, and looked down one last time at the two belts resting side by side in the morning light. Her father's worn soft with years of quiet discipline. Hers still new, still learning what it was going to become. She thought about the ripple that had started in a hallway 3 weeks into her first semester and had somehow, in less than a year, reached 2 other universities, now quietly reviewing their own donor-linked disciplinary records. She thought about Priya, who had finally agreed just last month to speak with a reporter about her experience for the first time since transferring away her voice, steady now, in a way it hadn't been during that first phone call with Renee. She thought about Kayla back in Dallas, who'd started volunteering with a local advocacy organization, telling Harper once that she finally understood what it felt like to turn a wound into something useful, instead of something you simply carried alone forever. None of it undid what had happened. Harper understood that clearly, standing there in the quiet cemetery grass. Nothing ever fully undoes a thing like that. But something had shifted regardless. Something real and lasting, built out of small, stubborn decisions made by ordinary people who had simply finally refused to look away. "I'll come back," she told him softly. "I always will." She said it the way she'd once heard him make a promise to his own father years ago. Steady and unhurried, a vow meant to be kept rather than simply spoken. She lingered another moment, listening to the wind move through the grass, watching a hawk circle slowly, somewhere above the tree line at the edge of the cemetery. The kind of quiet, ordinary beauty her father had always pointed out to her as a child, insisting she stop and actually notice it instead of rushing past. Then she turned and walked back toward her car and toward whatever came next, carrying her father's name the only way that had ever really mattered. Not as a weight she had to bear alone, but as a promise she intended for the rest of her life to keep. The drive home passed easily, the late afternoon sun low and golden across the highway, and somewhere around the Texas state line, Harper's phone buzzed again. Another message from Ivy, this was one longer, describing how her younger sister's high school had already agreed to let her start a small after-school program that fall using the same basic curriculum Harper had built from nothing but a heavy bag in a college dormitory basement and a lifetime of lessons learned from a man who never got to see how far they would travel. Harper smiled, set the phone down, and kept driving the road stretching out ahead of her, set and open and entirely her own. Years later, long after she'd graduated and moved on to a career in counseling, that had grown almost inevitably out of everything she'd learned that freshman year. Harper would still think back on that drive home from the cemetery as the moment the story finally finished changing shape in her mind. It stopped being a story about what had been done to her. It became instead a story about everything she'd built afterward out of documentation and discipline and the stubborn refusal of a handful of people to stay quiet any longer. Her father had taught her that violence was always the last resort. What he'd never quite gotten the chance to teach her, because he hadn't lived long enough to see her learn it for herself, was that courage. Real courage was almost never loud. Most of the time it looked exactly like what Walter had done in a locked drawer, and what Coach Owens had done in a quiet phone call, and what Renee had done by finally picking up her phone to make 3 difficult calls in a single weekend. Quiet, steady, and utterly unwilling to look away. That, in the end, was the inheritance her father had actually left her. Not the belt, though she kept it always. Not even his name, though she carried that proudly too. It was the simple, steady understanding that protecting people who cannot protect themselves is never wasted, even when it costs you everything, and especially when it doesn't.